I'd like to introduce you to the director, Lana Jokel. And with us also are Vincent Fremont and Shelly Fremont. So Lana, I'll start with you. Yeah, try it.
One. Are we on?
Yeah. Lana, how did you get this access? It's extraordinary. Tell us how you first met Andy and how you became so close that he would trust you to this extent.
Well, actually, I met him at Max's Kansas City when I first came to New York. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I met Andy probably at Max's Kansas City way back when I first came to New York. And then I started my film career at Pennybaker. And I was fortunate to edit my Norman Mailer's film, Maidstone. So right after I finished editing Maidstone, somehow Andy and Paul Morrissey, they somehow tracked me down and asked if I wouldn't edit their film Heat, which is actually a film by Paul Morrissey. And this was the beginning when they wanted to make films that had dialogues and more conventional and not just turning the camera on. So then Jed Johnson, who was then also Andy's partner in life, and we started to edit Heat at the factory. And so I had a lot of access to him, even then already. But then what happened was during the summer, he rented a house in East Hampton, and Jed and I came out to East Hampton with our machines, the steam bags, and we would edit all summer, and Andy and Paul Morrissey and Fred would join us on the weekends. So we were kind of like a little family, and so I got to really know him pretty well, after so many weekends. And then we went back to the factory in the fall to finish editing Heat at the factory. So at that point, he said to me, Lana, why don't you have a baby with your boyfriend, Michael, so that we can have a factory baby, and I'll be the godfather. And I said, well, I'm very traditional, conventional. I'm not married. I don't really want to have a baby right now anyway. I said, well, how about I like to make my first documentary film in which I can direct myself. How about you being the subject? He said, gee, well, all right. So that's how it started. And since I already know him pretty well by then, that's what happened.
Well, the fact that he's so relaxed with you and that you get so much information from him, which is different from the other films that we see on Warhol, it's just extraordinary. It's what makes this so unique and so marvelous.
Well, in the summer, actually, in the East Hampton house, we were shared to do some of the workload. And one point, I was trying to cook some Chinese food, which I'm not a good cook anyway, so I was having a lot of trouble. And so Andy said, well, what can I do? So then Jed said, well, why don't you sweep the kitchen floor? So he said, well, all right. He was always very sweet and helpful, And then we were going to the beach, and he said, well, I can't because of my skin, So I said, well, look, I have a big hat, huge hat. He said, oh, well, can I borrow it? I said, yeah. So we all went to the beach, and he had this huge hat on, looking kind of funny. But he was very easy to, get along with, always very sweet. Vincent Shelly can tell you about that.
Yes, why don't you tell us a little bit about your association with him and the factory?
I never thought he was demonic. But I have to say, Dee's, first of all, I want to say, Lana, that your documentary really, really holds up. I've seen it over the years, and I haven't seen it for quite a while. And every time I see it, it's still, I see more and more that I hadn't remembered. And it really is prescient in certain ways, because we're looking back on Andy now 2, 3 years after he's gone. It's extraordinary. So
thank you.
I tip my hat, which I'm not wearing. I came to New York in the weekend of Woodstock. I came with 2 other friends. We were a group called the Babies. We had long hair, if you could imagine. I had long blonde hair with bangs. We looked like an LA rock and roll band, very androgynous. The problem was we were a conceptual band, and we went to Max's Kansas City in the back room, and Danny Fields, who was the record executive who managed the Ramones and Iggy, and he dubbed us the group that came from nowhere that did nothing, because we didn't play instruments. So I met Andy probably the third. We checked into the Chelsea Hotel. I met Andy with probably the third day in New York City. My two friends, Tim and Michael, had met Andy 6 months before, and we went up to the sixth floor. And if you can imagine, the sixth floor. This is roughly a year after the assassination attempt. There was a Dutch door. That was the security, and the top part was open. There was a buzzer, but who cares? Probably Joe D'Alessandro was sitting at the desk that I ended up sitting at some point. But I spent the afternoon with Andy. My two friends left. He then got his Euro tape recorder. This is before the portable Sony tape recorders. He interviewed me for at least an hour, asking me about so many questions. And if you were male, that was one in. Two, if you're a good talker, that's the second one. So I didn't shut up for hours. And so little did I realize that moment I was going to be a lifer. I freelanced some work with him in the fall of '69. Interviewing people about Oh Calcutta, because he didn't want to do that with the Diners Club, and we edited it together. I went back to California to get out of the draft, came back in December 70, and he asked me to work full-time in 71, and that's where it started. And I got involved with video and blah, blah, blah. Shelly?
Yeah.
How I met Andy? Oh, I met him.
Nature of your relationship too.
Oh, well, I met him when I was dating Larry Rivers when I was in college. Yeah. Another story. But, and that's when I first met Lana, when I went to dinner at her house with Larry. So I've known her for a long time ago. A long time ago. So, but I met him at Andy at a party at Francois de Menil's. I think I'd come with Larry, and I couldn't believe Andy Warhol was there. And I went over, and at that point I worked at Bonwit Teller in the art department. So I said, oh, I work at Bonwit's. I know you used to work there. And he was like, oh, yes, that was my first job. And then, as I knew him over the years, we'd be walking down the street and he'd say, oh, look, there's so-and-so. They gave me my first job. I said, wait, didn't you work at Bonwit's? He said, oh, yeah, that was another one of my first jobs. He had a million first jobs. And he remembered everyone who had ever helped him out. So, then when I started dating Vincent, it was
the war of the flowers between me and Larry Rivers.
It was fun.
And Andy was very loyal to all his friends, and so he knew he had met Shelly, obviously, but he was loyal to Larry, and so it was a tug of war, but eventually
he came around.
Yeah, but but working with Andy, as Lana said, it's very interesting to hear, like D'Antonio, aka D, talk about Andy and all the weekend people came and were destructive people. Yeah, a lot of people were. There were no interventions in the 60s. Edie Sedgwick was already fucked up when she got there. These people were, they were performing, and there was a certain voyeuristic attitude of Andy's, but he was always that way. He was curious, he was looking, and he wasn't judgmental. So there was no code or guide of how you're supposed to handle people. Because in the 70s, we kind of changed, the world changed. It was, Andy gets shot in 68. By 71, when I'm hired, Fred Hughes made a concerted effort to make it more of a business, and Paul Morrissey. So Paul and Fred got rid of all the people that came into the studio randomly, because I think it was Henry Geltzeller was correct. People really, or maybe it was whatever you say, people did want to get Andy's attention. So a lot of people flocked around, and there were a lot of posers. So we started editing them out. Fred and Paul started getting rid of the ones. But every afternoon in the early 70s at 33 Union Square West, Michael Nitter was videotaping. I started videotaping. So we documented that period quite well with the drag queens and the ones who wanted to be in Paul's movies. And so there was this kind of constant creative energy that was going on. And it wasn't destructive. Again, I didn't know Andy in the 1960s, but when people ask me about my education, I always tell them I went to the University of Andy Warhol, because I didn't go to college. I started working. I met Andy when I was 18. So I was lucky enough, and I think fortunate, to be working with one of the great artists of the 20th century. He was still, to this day, misunderstood. And of course, we all have our own, perspective of who he is. You put 10 people in the room and ask them who's Andy Warhol, you're going to get 10 different opinions. Some I will agree with and some I won't. But I still, standing here, now the old man, I still protect his legacy.
Why do you think there's a burst of renewed interest in him right now? Or do you agree? Maybe.
There are, the Netflix show is one. But even before that, Andy never goes away. They try to bury him. The critics try to bury him. The bigger the hole they got, the bigger Andy got. They kept digging harder, and they kept trying to bury him, and he got bigger and bigger. Because you can't destroy somebody like that, because he was a visionary. He was one of those intuitive people that really saw the world, in a different way, but a way that no one else. We're still catching up with some of the things that he was thinking about or trying to create. And he did have a great sense of humor. He had a sense of irony, which you see in your film, and that's what I try to get to tell people. He was a human being. He did have moments of doubt and all this other stuff, but he was this incredible workaholic that was there to create, and he was one of the people, I think, the few people of the 20th century that's born at the right time, the right place. And there's very few of those people who really make a mark on our culture and society, and he's one of them.
True. Shelly, I just want to say that Francois Dumenil, where you met everybody, is a board member of Sag Harbor Cinema, so we're groovy too here. So, Lana, could you tell us a little bit about how you chose the people that you interviewed?
Well, pretty much I wanted to get a variety of different people around Andy in those days. And first of all, of course, there are the art authorities, art world figures like David Bourdon, Henry Geldzeller, and Mario Maya and Barbara Rose, whom I knew very well already because we worked on some films together on American art in the 60s and the New York School. So she and I became friends also. So I wanted to have the art world people. And then I wanted to have some of these superstars, but I didn't really know them individually too well, except a couple of times they all came to my apartment in New York with Andy for Sunday brunch. And all the drag queens, Candy Darling, Holly Woodlawn, Jackie Curtis, and my elevator man said, "Oh, Mrs. Jokel, you have the most interesting friends." And I live in a very conservative building. And I said, "Oh, yes, they are just wonderful." He said, "Oh, it's the most exciting I've ever seen this building." And so I have that crowd. And then, of course, Andy had his close friends like Vincent and Bob and Jed and, all that. And so I wanted to get different people in his life, from the art world to his personal life. And I think I was fortunate to get quite a bit of his personal life because of the time we spent in East Hampton, and I got to know. And then he and Paul Morris were very kind to let me choose whatever I wanted from their films, including, Heat and L'Amour and
Women in Revolt,
Women
which
in
is
Revolt,
still
which
is still such a great film.
I know, I edited the trailer of
you
the
did?
Women in Revolt.
I remember when they were trying to figure out the title, and we opened it at the Cine Malibu on 59th Street and 2nd Avenue, and it was known as a porn house. And so Candy worked the opening night. There was a line, and Candy put on a trench coat. She was going up and down, working the audience, saying hello and stuff. So we four-walled this film, meaning that we distributed it ourselves. So we made a deal with the theater, and guess who got to be there every night? Me. I had no social life for 6 weeks, because I would go there in the afternoon, and lots of guys would be coming in thinking they're going to see a porn movie. And meanwhile, look what they got to see. They got Candy Darling and Holly Woodlawn. So it was, and every night I had to go in and counted the money, and I literally carried money in a chemical bank bag down to Chemical Bank on 17th Street in Park Avenue South, put it in the night deposit, and reported the next day, how it was. But what was fascinating is to watch that film every night, and every night there would be certain places where the laughs would come in. So I learned a lot about rhythm of editing and what plays, and it really was incredible. But I would sit up with the projectionist. It was a lonely time.
When did the Paul Morrissey films become more mainstream, showing at Cinema 1 and Cinema 2?
Well, Trash was the first movie that really made money for Paul and Andy. That's got them the money to buy the Montauk House. 1972. Paul's first film he did directed by himself after Andy got shot, and he decided to produce the films, and so Paul, that's Flesh, so it's a trilogy, Flesh, Trash, Heat. Paul was involved with Women Revolt, and then, later on, much later, there was a moment where Paul wanted to separate his films from Andy's films, and I was the negotiator between the two, which was painful, because Paul never wanted. Paul was coming in and out of town, and then he wouldn't make up his mind. And then I go to Andy, say, "Well, this is this group of paintings and films, and this was this group." But eventually, it worked out. But Paul left Andy's studio right after Dracula and Frankenstein, so that's 75-ish, 74, 75. So, and I think that Paul really like he said, he cared about a plot. Andy didn't care about a beginning, middle, and ending. He liked people talking in characters, and you look at his films, but he did, as D'Antonio put, he did the history of film, from silence to talkies. And it's very important if you watch of his filmmaking, and it's finally getting the attention that it should get, because after Andy died, John Hanhart did a film retrospective of the Whitney, and then a television retrospective, which is all material that Michael Netter shot, that I shot, that Andy shot, which then was dubbed Factory Diaries, which was apropos, because Andy really wanted us to be videotaping 24 hours a day. So, but I also knew it was important, and here's I just noticed, D'Antonio says Andy never touched a painting. It was all, sorry, wrong. I thank God I videotaped him painting a giant Mao. Michael Nutter and I called it Beat the Clock, based on the TV show, because contestants had to do something in a short period of time. So Andy loved the idea because he loved television. He knew the sex. So he painted the background of a 15-foot Mao in 30 minutes, or roughly 30 minutes, the time of the reel to reel. It's great to watch him working. He's finger painting around certain parts. You see him working. I taped him with doing the drag queen paintings, the hammer and sickle. So it's very important for younger people to know he was hands-on. And by the way, silk screening is hands-on. You're taking a squeegee across. He's editing the image. He's cropping the image. David Bourdon was very astute in his the discussion about the flowers, and also the fact everybody has this let the imagination run, like the female flowers and the male flowers, and also there's also the fact they're sexual. People have said, because of the stem. So, it's really interesting. And Andy loved everybody to talk about it. Andy never spoke about his artwork, really. It's there for you to look at and see what you get out of it.
Lana, could you tell us a little bit about your shoot in Cannes?
Oh, yes. What happened was after we finished editing Heat, it was submitted to the Cannes Film Festival. So we were going to show the film at the Director's Fortnight, which is not part of the competition, but yeah. So we went, and I had just at that time gotten permission to make my first film on Andy. So also being the editor of Heat, I went along, and the budget of my documentary did not allow me to bring a crew of cameramen or soundmen, and so I just went along, and I brought my 16mm camera, and I brought a separate tape recorder. So I just did all the filming myself, but without sync sounds. So all the quick cuts you see in Europe, just from my camera work, and then I used whatever I recorded, so on. But it was great fun because, again, we were like a little family, except Sylvia Miles wanted to stay at the hotel.
Oh, Sylvia.
Yeah, and we all stayed at Jerome Hill's house in Beyond. But it was.
I love you got Lester Persky in there.
I know.
Yeah, I know.
That's a flashback, because Lester was in part, starting in the 60s around with Andy. So it's.
Yeah, we have a lot of those people, like Peter
No,
Beard and all those people.
You've got so many good people in this film who are no longer with us.
I know, it's so
really,
sad.
it's very historical, I think. It's, at least in my point of view, but it's.
Yes, so many of them are gone, and it's wonderful to see them talking, on camera and live, and like Bridget and Viva, and of course they're all gone. But
Bridget was always trying to disassociate herself from Andy. After those years, Shelly and I did a documentary on Bridget called Pie in the Sky, the Bridget Berlin story. It came out in 2000. But Bridget, was a natural, and they really had a loving relationship. So it's just, and the fact that she's always saying I want to disassociate, because she stayed at the front part of she was in the back of Max's and she was in the front of Max's. The front of Max's was what she called the heavies, and this is where Larry Poons, John Chamberlain, Judd, all the the serious artists, and Rauschenberg, she was one of the guys, which is really interesting because not many women were allowed into that world, and she was kind of an equal. She spent a lot of time with Rauschenberg. She spent a lot of time with Larry Rivers. And she was an artist, even though she denied it. But this idea of separating, they were like a married couple, as Bob Colacello said in our documentary, and she was the only one who could yell at him like a wife. And he's the only one who gave her the wrong present, knowing it's the wrong one, but it set her off. They knew how to set each other off. Key words, so... Now, it brings back a lot of memories because there was a lot of, unlike a lot of people again think that Andy was, I have to say the Netflix is really well done, but they make Andy try to be the saddest, loneliest person in the world, and it's just not true. You see it in this documentary. He's smiling, he's having a good time, he's ironic, he's funny. So it does bring back a lot of good memories.
I think he was just really himself, with his friends and so on. And you're right, he's very funny, but also there's a wonderful sensibility in him that, doesn't always project in the Netflix series, I think. And although it's very well made,
because Andy did have a public persona that was not to say anything and play the village idiot.
Yeah.
But that was the complete opposite of what he really was. And he loved to gossip. He was on the phone with Bridget and other people every day. He walked down when he moved to 66th Street, he was walking down Madison Avenue as the publisher, Interview magazines, handing them out. So he really cared about people. He liked, as you see in the movie, he actually liked children. He's the godfather to our first daughter, Austin.
So you got...
Yeah. Well, then the funny thing was later we had a second daughter, Casey, and I didn't want to ask him twice, but then he said to me, I could be the godfather too. I missed the boat on that one. So one. But he was very sweet. He was sweet. When Jay Jagger would come out to Montauk when she was like 4, he would play the tape recorder backwards fast and do all sorts of things. And he had this kind of he loved children. He didn't want children. And if anybody said he wanted, there has been some people say they were going to marry him. He would have their baby. No. That
just want his dogs.
Huh?
He just want the dogs.
Yeah, and you see him that wonderful shot of him playing with that dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see it. That shows. That's showing another personal side of Andy, which was a lot of people don't see.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the room. Oh,
maybe not.
Oh no, we have to stop. Oh, can we have just one question? Sorry.
Oh, I thought we had all night.
Yes. Here you go.
Sorry.
Could you repeat the question?
The time frame. What year was that when you came to Hamptons?
The time frame.
Oh, this
of
was
the
in
Hamptons.
1971 or 2 when we were out here. And he rented a house on Ackerbog Road in East Hampton, where Jed and I edited. And then this was, of course...
Yeah, I came out one weekend, I remember.
Yeah. No, we had a good time. And he was always picking my brains about, tell me all about Norman Mailer. What was he like? Did he have many mistresses? Did you have an affair with him? Da, 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 da. I mean, he loves to ask questions.
What was the answer, Lana?
No comment. So then...
They won't
No
tell
comment.
anybody. It'll stay in this room.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean, I really liked Andy a lot. He was so sweet and gentle, during the period I was there. And then later he said, well, why don't you stay on the factory, be part of the factory? But, being a traditional Chinese woman, I said, no, I'm going to move on. I want to do other things. And so I didn't become a superstar, but made many films after that.
You did too, Lana. One more question, please.
By the way, why do we have to leave?
There's another show.
Oh.
It's a movie theater.
What, you mean it's open to the public?
It's
Well, okay, just before we leave, many of you are friends, and you've been invited to a reception I'm hosting. So I'm extending the invitation to everybody here. whether you're invited or not to go up afterwards so we can talk more, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Wendy especially because she pitched in last minute, but I mean, you all know how much she knows about films and things. She's a dear old friend of mine, and she's just always picking up when we need her most.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. And thank you, Vincent and Shelly.